So we're going to discuss, as I said, I had the idea last week. Let's discuss prohibition, and then use that as a way to have a discussion about constitutional amendments. I was thinking, should we do amendments first and then prohibition? Because prohibition is going to be talking about the 18th and 21st Amendment to the Constitution. But let's look at the history first, and then we can look at the Constitution after that.
Okay.
Tolulopa, thank you for logging in. We're just getting started here. So prohibition, between the two amendments, the period of prohibition, what we call prohibition, was 1920 to 1933. 1920 was the 18th Amendment that prohibited the sale. I always thought it was the consumption, but it's not the consumption. It was still legal to drink alcohol, but you just couldn't buy it or sell it. So the 18th Amendment prohibits the sale and purchase of alcohol, and the 33rd or 1933 was the 21st Amendment that repeals the 18th Amendment. So we'll take a look at that time period. So this is from a different website than I normally do. This is Khan Academy, which maybe you've heard of before. They do very good, very high quality online lessons. They started out as just math videos, but now they have all different things at Khan Academy. So there's the link, and I'll of course send this out. But it says, for the overview of prohibition, it says prohibition was a nationwide ban on the sale and import of alcoholic beverages. It lasted from 1920 to 1933. Protestants, progressives, and women all spearheaded the drive to institute prohibition. Prohibition led directly to the rise of organized crime. It's going to focus on that a little bit. And the 21st Amendment, ratified in December 1933, repealed prohibition. So we'll look at the history, and then we'll, in a different article here, we'll zoom in on the amendment process. How do you pass, and why would you pass a constitutional amendment? So first, the temperance movement. Jasmine, could you read paragraph 1?
Sure. The roots of the temperance movement stretched all the way back to the early 19th century. The American Temperance Society, founded in 1826, encouraged voluntary abstinence from alcohol and influenced many successors organizations which advocated mandatory prohibition on the sale and import of alcoholic beverages. Many religious sects and denominations, and especially Methodists, became active in the temperance movement. Women were especially influential. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, founded in 1873, was one of the leading advocates of prohibition.
Okay, so the opposition to alcohol is very, very old. You know, they didn't just, it doesn't start in 1920. People have opposed alcohol probably for as long as there has been alcohol, thousands of years. So even, thinking back to the Pilgrims in the 1620s, there's always, through America and through other countries, there's been some people opposed to alcohol, to drinking alcohol. And so you have now, through the 1800s, the rise of these, particularly the American Temperance Society is the big one. Mm-hmm. You have the rise of these big community organizations, which is interesting because today I don't think we have, I think society is much different, obviously, than it was then. And whereas we have Twitter now and Facebook, and you can communicate with billions of people, with one click. Back then it was if you wanted to go and have a conversation with somebody, you had to go and have a conversation with somebody. And if you wanted to find people that agree with you, you had to join a group like the American Temperance Society. So it's just kind of interesting to compare, how do things get done? Today it's easy to get on Twitter or Facebook and find a million people that share your views. but they're not necessarily in your town or in your neighborhood. Nor does that always turn into action, you know. Whereas the American Temperance Society, these groups would have meetings. It was a national group. Of course, there was local smaller groups within it. They would have meetings. They would try to get things done. So there was a real push, founded in 1826, a real push to actually not just be opposed to drinking alcohol, and women are opposed to their husband drinking alcohol, and they try to change his specific behavior, but also change the laws in your town. And the dream would be to change the Constitution, and so that was kind of what they were aiming for. Nadia, could you read paragraph 2, which spills onto the next page there?
Just a moment, please. During the Progressive era, calls for prohibition became more strident. In many ways, temperance activities were seeking for, I don't know how to pronounce next word, ameliorate to negative social effects of rapid industrialization. Salons and the heavy drinking culture were associated with immigrants and members of the working class, and were seen as detrimental to the values of Christian society. The Anti-Salons League, with strong support from Protestants and other Christian denominations,
That's good.
To read this word, spearheaded the drive for national-wide prohibition. In fact, the Anti-Salon League was the most powerful political pressure group in U.S. history. No other organization had ever managed to alter the nation's constitution. Oh, I'm sorry if I did a mistake.
No, that's good. Let's talk about a few of those words. There's some really good vocabulary words here. Calls for prohibition became more strident. What does that mean if something is more strident? Or your feelings on this topic are very strident.
Very strong.
Very strong, right?
Like sharp.
Yeah, I think the root word is like stride, like walking, like your stride is the way you walk. So I think it means they're taking steps forward. It's very aggressive. They're trying to make progress. It's very strident, very strong feelings. Temperance activists were seeking to ameliorate the negative social effects of rapid industrialization. So the negative social effects of rapid industrialization, which means at that time, late 1800s, a lot of people are moving from farms to cities, from working on a farm to working in a factory. And historians study all kinds of how does that change people and families and society, going from farm life to factory work. And so there's a lot of negative social effects, and they're trying to ameliorate those social effects. What do you think ameliorate means?
They were trying to create an awareness.
Yeah, create an awareness. Ameliorate is like to counteract something negative. So there's negative social effects. They're trying to ameliorate, to try to offset or counteract the negative social effects.
Is that correct word for this? Improve?
To improve, yeah. Although ameliorate isn't so much like, let me think of an example. In my mind, ameliorate it's sort of like to improve the situation. Let's say, I don't know, I'm just thinking of an example. Let's say me and my wife are, parents to our children. Say she's very strict. And so, and it can be very hard on the kids. And so I try to ameliorate the situation by being very nice. not necessarily changing her behavior, but I'm offsetting it, I'm counteracting it by being very nice and very not strict to our children. So ameliorate doesn't really necessarily mean to change anything, but it means to change the situation by counteract. Really, what I can think of is counteracting it. Okay, so they're trying to improve the situation by counteracting the negative social effects. Saloons, maybe that's a tricky word, Nadia. A saloon is like we don't think of saloons now, but a saloon, what would we call a saloon today? Anybody? If you were to, back in the Wild West or the 1800s, if you were to walk into a saloon,
it was like a bar.
A bar. It's a bar, yeah. A saloon is like an old, it's not something we think of today, but a saloon is a bar where they serve alcohol. So the Anti-Saloon League is anti-bars. They're anti is against, and so they're trying to close saloons, close down the bars. What else would be seen as detrimental? Detrimental is just harmful to the values of Christian society. Detrimental is harmful. The Anti-Saloon League spearheaded the drive for nationwide prohibition. Spearheaded is like the head of a spear, and so they're like the point, the one that's doing the cutting, the leading the charge for something, to spearhead a movement. Okay, so you have the Anti-Saloon League, which the Women's Christian Temperance Union and the American Temperance Society were pretty peaceful. The Anti-Saloon League, these people would smash. This is a picture of sheriffs smashing like giant barrels of alcohol. So the Anti-Saloon League got much more aggressive in how they tried to fight this problem. Okay. So enacting prohibition, the 18th Amendment. Tolu Lope, could you read paragraph 3? You're pretty quiet. Why don't you try that again? Can you? Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, the 18th Amendment was ratified on January 16, 1919, and went into effect 1 year later on January 17, 1920. The 18th Amendment reflected the progressive space in the federal government's ability to fix social problems. Because the law did not specifically outlaw the consumption of alcohol, however, many U.S. citizens stockpiled personal reserves of beer, wine, and liquor before the ban took effect.
Thank you. So that's really interesting. So it was ratified and became law January 16, 1919, and then a year and a day later, which was on purpose, they specifically did this on purpose. A year and a day later, it took effect, and so alcohol became illegal to sell or buy. But it did not outlaw the consumption of alcohol. So people stockpiled their own, in their own basement, they stockpiled reserves of beer, wine, and liquor. Okay, so now, as the overview up above said, this is going to lead to a rise in organized crime. So paragraph 4 says, though the advocates of prohibition had argued that banning sales of alcohol would reduce criminal activity, it in fact directly contributed to the rise of organized crime. After the 18th Amendment went into force, bootlegging, or the illegal distillation, making, and sale of alcoholic beverages became widespread. Al Capone was the most notorious of the Prohibition-era gangsters who made their fortunes from the illegal distillation and sale of alcohol. Many law enforcement agencies simply lacked the resources to consistently and effectively enforce prohibition. The consumption of alcohol did not go down during Prohibition. People drank just as much. So, which means if you're the Anti-Saloon League or the American Temperance Society, you're going to be fairly discouraged that, okay, we got our 18th Amendment. The sale and purchasing of alcohol is illegal according to the U.S. Constitution. Hip hip hooray! And yet the average person drinks just as much alcohol. So these gangsters were, and organized crime, Al Capone, were making and selling alcohol. You would have illegal bars and saloons. Like you'd go into a restaurant, and if you said the password or knocked on a door with a secret knock, you would be led into a back room, a secret room that they called speakeasies. And they were like a lounge or a bar, and that is where they secretly sold alcohol. So there's still bars during Prohibition. There's still saloons. They're just secret, illegal, and the government is not regulating anything. So now we're going to see, after a decade, why did they repeal it? Why did they go the other direction? Jasmine, could you read paragraph 5?
Sure. Women were just as active in the anti-prohibition campaign as they have been in the campaign to enact prohibition. The Women's Organization for National Prohibition Reform led the drive for repeal. The organization framed its campaign in moral terms, arguing that the effects of prohibition, the rise of a criminal class, the corruption of public officials, and a widespread disrespect for the rule of law represented a serious threat to American homes and families.
Okay, go ahead, Jasmine, read paragraph 6 and then we'll talk.
Sure. Another factor militating in favor of repeal was the onset of the Great Depression. Given the dire economic situation facing the nation, the federal government could not afford to forego the tax revenues from the production and consumption of alcoholic beverages.
Okay, thank you. And Carmen, I see you logged in. Thank you for logging in. Today we are talking about prohibition in the 1920s when alcohol was illegal. And then that's going to lead us in a minute to talking about constitutional amendments. So Carmen, thanks for logging in. Do you have a microphone today?
Thank you, teacher.
Yeah, no, certainly. Thanks for logging in. And my name's Matt. So yeah, let's jump in. So after a decade here of prohibition, there were probably actually starting the day that it started, there was people against it. So what do we see here are the two reasons people were against prohibition?
The rise of the criminal class and the corruption of public officials.
Right, they say people are still going to drink alcohol. My neighbors are still drinking alcohol, but now it's illegal. So now you're encouraging people to break the law.
Mm-hmm.
Now we have all these gangsters, illegally producing alcohol, selling alcohol, fighting each other violently. We've got the rise of the criminal class, corruption of public officials, which means, cops would accept bribes to turn the other way and not, they know that illegal secret bar is in the back of that restaurant, but the cops are now taking bribes so that they don't turn them in. So now it's just this, it says a widespread disrespect for the rule of law. It's just created a situation now where people are breaking the law, doing the same thing that before they did legally.
Right.
So that's one thing now. where is that same argument being used today? A very similar argument to make a change. What change do some people want today? Then they use that same argument. What recreational marijuana? Okay, people make the same. Now it's not exactly the same because here people are trying to reverse the law, but they make the same argument. People are going to smoke marijuana, and some people, people say, well, it's not the worst drug in the world, and blah blah blah. But so they say our jails are being filled with people who are being arrested for smoking marijuana. Marijuana is not the worst thing in the world. If we were to make it legal, then fewer people would be in jail. So it's a similar argument. And it's conceivable the way society moves along and changes over time. I think it's perfectly conceivable. I don't really have an opinion one way or the other, but I think it's perfectly conceivable looking forward into the future that at some point marijuana will be legal and we'll be looking back on it as equal, essentially as equal in society to alcohol, I think. I don't know. It'll be interesting to see. What's the other reason that they were against prohibition? Why they said it's bad?
The tax revenues.
Right. If when alcohol was legal, then not only are there legitimate companies making alcohol, people, I guess, jobs, people can have jobs, but also the government can tax the sale of alcohol and gain tax revenue. So it says the government, and this is during the last week we talked about the stock market crash. When did that happen?
1929.
1929. So this is the beginning of the Great and so it says the federal government could not afford to forego the tax revenues. Forego is to give up, to pass on something. So they're giving up tax revenue.
So it's all about money.
Well, yeah, at the time, I mean, it'd be interesting to know how much money are we talking? It must have been a pretty good amount of tax that if you were to tax all the alcohol sales, it must have, I bet you it wasn't a lot of money.
Sorry. That's the same like in Europe, some countries just made legal prostitution.
Oh, yeah. Huh. Well, that's another thing.
Because of taxes. To give a job to some woman, like legal job.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yeah, all these things are vices, and some people say they're bad, and some people say they're okay, and some people say they're terrible. But I guess, prostitution's a little bit in a different direction, but it's same kind of thing, if we tax it, and certainly prostitution's another question. If the government is involved in regulating, now I don't know anything about European prostitution, but if the government's involved, then you can have safety, make women and women and men safer in that situation. If there's laws governing it, then maybe that's a good
because
thing.
They can have everyone involved in this process, like all women, to have medical checkup regularly, so clients can be satisfied.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, that's an argument for for legalizing and regulating prostitution. It's not so that everybody can become a prostitute, and alcohol, and repealing prohibition isn't so that everybody can drink alcohol, but it's
actually I
it's
myself against this, because I think the world will go just crazy if we will make everything what we think bad if we make it legal.
Yeah, no, it's interesting, and over time, as we see here, society changes and people's view on things change. They pass the 18th Amendment, and then 13 years later, they repeal it. So now looking at history, looking backwards and looking forwards, I think it's interesting how society and societal views change. So it says, paragraph 7, the 21st Amendment, which repealed the 18th Amendment, was ratified on December 5th, 1933, conclusively ending the nation's ban on the manufacture and distribution of alcohol. Prohibition was a social experiment that had nurtured the very ills that it sought to ameliorate: criminal activity, public corruption, and a casual disregard for the rule of law. So here's some things we can talk about for a minute. Why did progressives, and especially women, support the ban on alcohol sales? What was their reason for prohibition? Let me scroll up and see if we can find. What was the reasoning for prohibition?
It was against a lot of their religious views.
Yeah, it really. I mean, it was started with, it focused on religious views. It was alcohol, people would say, is the root of a lot of social ills, a lot of social problems.
Right. And the effects of alcohol, the way people behaved while on alcohol as well.
Mm-hmm. Right. And it says the 18th Amendment reflected the progressives. This is a certain group of people they call themselves at that time, and today even, progressives, meaning that they're trying to bring about what they view as progress in society. So it reflected the progressives' faith in the federal government's ability to fix social problems, which is another thing that comes and goes throughout history. Sometimes at different moments in history, people want the government involved, passing laws, changing society for the better. And then at other times, people say, no, I don't want the government to make that decision for me. So this is a moment, in the 1920s where they thought that the government, we have this government, we can pass laws, we should pass laws that fix society's problems. Okay, next question. Do you think prohibition was an effective solution to the ills of a rapidly industrializing society? Why or why not? What do you think? What do you guys think?
I think no. My personal belief, if people will not change inside, any law can stop them.
Right, yeah, the consumption of alcohol, I mean, it'd be interesting. I should probably have a few facts here, but the consumption of alcohol did not change. So do you think it was the right move to then repeal, given that nothing changed, and of course criminal activity and organized crime went up? Do you all agree it was the right thing to repeal it?
Probably, yeah. I agree. It's not very effective.
Right. So what do you think?
I'm sorry. I think that's all about desire. If someone has some desire inside and it will be illegal, he will find the way.
Sure. Oh yeah, I agree. So where do you think the American Temperance Society turned their efforts after the 23rd Amendment? Now alcohol is legal again. What do you think they focused on?
Now, what they focus, not like it's legal, but not for everyone. kids can't drink any alcohol, can buy any alcohol. Or actually, I was experiencing this week at Walmart. I wanted to buy some super glue, and I was not allowed to make my purchase on
Oh,
self-checkout because they needed proof of my age. I needed to show them ID. I was over the 21.
oh,
I was so surprised. I
super
never
glue.
knew that. Yeah. So, and then I wanted to buy whiteouts. You know this if you make some mistakes in writing and want to correct it.
Right.
And they needed my ID to let me buy this. I was really surprised. This happened to me first time in my life.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's the government. We've passed laws that people. I think for whiteout, I think people like if you inhale the fumes, it basically acts as a drug. Other things I know, cough medicine. Isn't cough medicine used in making one of
Yeah,
these
I've heard
big drugs?
about this. There, yeah, back in Ukraine, that can use cough medicine to make drugs.
Right, and so sometimes you get I don't know if they card you. You have to be a certain age, but I know sometimes you can't buy. Like if you can buy it, you're not allowed to buy a lot of it at one time or something like that. Um, so yeah, the government regulates. We have a government that hopefully we the majority of us can agree is meant to protect us from things. Protect us and our neighbors from society's problems. Um, I think so. So what do we think? Where did the uh, the the progressive or the American Temperance Society? Where do you think they turned their attention after the Prohibition era? If they still feel that alcohol is wrong, where did they put their efforts?
They just let everyone, like all adult people, to make their own decision.
Well, legally, yeah, they would agree that it was up to each individual. I think the temperance movement, we started here with the discussion of the temperance movement. If you still feel, after the 1933, after the 21st Amendment, if you still feel that alcohol is wrong, you're not going to make an effort to change the law anymore. Now you're going to focus on people and reaching those around you in church, in your community, in your family, and changing their behavior even on a person by person basis. They changed the laws
Yeah, and it
and the
works
laws
better.
didn't work, right? So now, yeah, they I think, I would agree. You're going to do better by changing people's attitudes because they changed the laws and people still wanted to drink, and so they still drank alcohol. So same thing today, if you want to change people, you you can't change people's behavior. It's hard and usually unsuccessful to change people's behavior by force. You have
Yes,
to have them want
you're
to
right.
change their behavior. And an instance of understanding that. So we have the 14th or the 18th Amendment, the 21st Amendment. Prohibition lasts generally through the 1920s and a little bit into the Great Depression that we talked about last week. Prohibition comes to an end. Um, so interestingly, all those, think back on that day, the Black Thursday stock market crash. During that time, 1929, those stockbrokers, as the stock market plummeted, if they went home and had a drink of alcohol, it was an illegal drink of alcohol. So that's kind of an interesting crisscross of history. Okay, so let's look at constitutional amendments. How does it work? Let me find the page I want. Okay, so we're going to look I didn't make a document here, but I have in the document that I'll send out, I have, nope, that's not it. I have this link, and so this is the link that you can go to look at what we're going to see next. So here's another Khan Academy page about the amendment process. Now it says Article V, which is Roman numeral 5. Article 5 of the Constitution is where the founding fathers, when they wrote the Constitution in 1789, they explicitly addressed the issue of amending the Constitution. Now, why do you think they built in? If they wrote a Constitution, they probably thought it was pretty good. Why would they build in a process to change it?
Was it because they had other people on in that branch that were against it still?
There were, yeah, not everybody agreed to it. I don't know how many signers to the Constitution there were. How many people were in that discussion? But not everybody saw eye to eye. It was a compromise. The whole thing was a compromise. The reason we have two houses of Congress, the Senate works a particular way and the House of Representatives works a particular way, is because some of the states there represented wanted a Senate type of legislature, and some of them wanted a House of Representatives type of legislature. So they compromised and they did two separate houses, and every state would be represented in the Senate and the House of Representatives. So it was compromise. Yeah, not everybody saw eye to eye. So there may be some changes for that. But what would be another reason that they would build in a process to amend the Constitution?
Maybe just because they believe that society can be changed during the time, so something comes up, something new, just in case.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it was 1789 as they wrote the Constitution. They knew if this country is going to last a long time, it's not always going to be the same way that it was then, and so the world is going to change. Society is going to change, and so they said, well, people may want to change things, or situations may come up that we didn't think about, and so that we're going to want to change the Constitution. So that's what this section is. So the first thing they did, which was actually part of the compromising that they did to pass the Constitution, was some of the states wanted built into the Constitution, the right of free speech and right of freedom of religion and freedom of the press. And so they said, well, we're not going to put that in the Constitution, but right away, we're going to write and pass some amendments. And so next week, we're going to look at the bill, what they call the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments. They did it as a big group, and they did it basically right away, within 2 years of the Constitution passing, which is pretty much right away. Okay, so, but built into the Constitution, they have Article 5. Article 1 talks about the legislature. Article 2 talks about the presidency. Article 3 talks about the judicial branch. I don't remember what Article 4 talks about. And then Article 5 is them explaining the amendment process. So it's an important part of the Constitution. And it's not very long either. This is, right here is Article 5. Now it's a little bit confusing, but it's a way that an amendment has to be proposed by somebody and then agreed upon and then ratified by the states. Okay, so you could read this. It's understandable, but it's a little bit, it's like one really long sentence. So we'll look at it a little differently. It says there are two avenues for amending the Constitution: the congressional proposal method and the convention method. In the congressional proposal method, 2/3 of both chambers of Congress, the House of Representatives and the Senate, 2/3 of both chambers must propose an amendment. And it has to be the same. It's the same wording, the same information. The proposed amendment must then be ratified by 3/4 of the state conventions or state legislatures as chosen by Congress. Okay, so then we have a graphic here. Step 1, proposal. It can be the congressional method proposed by 2/3 of both houses of Congress, or the convention method proposal by 2/3 vote of a national convention. So Congress can pass, in the congressional method, Congress can pass an amendment, the House votes on it, and the Senate votes on it. And if they both pass by 2/3, then it's proposed. Or they can call a constitutional amendment convention, which is a special thing with special representatives that get together, do all the thinking and the writing, and they vote on it. That almost never happens. It's almost always the proposed by Congress. But then once it's proposed, it has to be ratified. It has to be approved, agreed to by 3/4 of one of two things. The state legislatures, which is like our state legislature in Harrisburg. We've elected a state Senate and a state House of Representatives. Not the Washington, D.C. people, but our state Pennsylvania government. Every state legislature in their state capital would vote on that amendment. And if 3/4 of them, 3/4 of the state, like Pennsylvania votes, if they agree, that's 1. If Ohio agrees, that's 2. If 3/4 of the states agree, then it passes. Or the states can do that work in a special state convention, but still that's state by state. And I don't really know which of those is more popular, but it has to be 3/4 of the states, and that's going to change. Right now we have 50 states, but we haven't always had 50 states. And so whatever 3/4 of that number of states is at the time, 3/4 have to agree to it. It says Congress has proposed all 27, well, there you go. Congress has proposed all 27 amendments to the Constitution of the United States. So they have never called a national convention. It could happen, but it's never happened. 26 of these 27 amendments were passed by 3/4 of the state legislatures, and 1 amendment was passed by 3/4 of state conventions. I don't know which one, under what circumstances they called one time they called state conventions. I don't know, but all have been proposed by Congress, and all but 1 were passed by the state legislatures, like our people sitting in Harrisburg. In the state convention method, well, that's not important because it almost never happens. Challenges to the amendment process. Okay. It says between 1789 and 2014, when this must have been written, over 11,000 amendments have been proposed. However, only 27 have been ratified. Why is it so hard for proposed amendments to receive support for final ratification? A few roadblocks are standing in their way. First, every amendment must receive support from 3/4 of state conventions or state legislatures. It's incredibly difficult to get that many states to agree on a permanent change to the Constitution. Take, for example, it says, the Equal Rights Amendment, or ERA. The ERA was introduced in 1923. It finally passed Congress in 1972 and was sent to the states for ratification. The ERA, Equal Rights Amendment, was designed to guarantee equal rights for all citizens regardless of sex. It fell 3 states short of ratification and so was not added to the Constitution. Now, since then, I guess in 2014 there were 3 states short. I don't know why exactly you'd be not in support of this amendment. I don't know much about it. But actually just recently, I think it was even within 2020, it might have been late 2019, but within the past couple of months, I forget how many it would take, but the final state, whatever 3/4 of 50 is, I don't know, the final state ratified it. So we almost had a new amendment, the Equal Rights Amendment, guaranteeing equal rights for citizens regardless of sex. We almost had it. But then, and that would have been huge news. It would be a constitutional amendment. But I should probably look this up. Maybe we could talk about it next week. It didn't count because they said it had been too long. And so, the statute of limitations, the time limit on the amendment, on the proposed amendment, the time was up. So the ERA, if you Google Equal Rights Amendment in the news, I think it came up lately, but like somehow it didn't happen because too much time had passed. It says, second, for an amendment to be passed through the congressional proposal method, 2/3 of Congress must propose the amendment. To introduce a new amendment, the two parties must cooperate, as no one party has controlled 2/3 of both the House and Representatives and the Senate. With each party supporting different ideological goals, getting 2/3 of Congress to agree on a change to the Constitution is nearly impossible without some level of cooperation. So let's look now at what are the 27 amendments. So there have been 27 times when the two parties do agree, and it is widely agreed upon that this change has to happen. The first 10 amendments, we can talk about it specifically next week. They're like your First Amendment: freedoms of speech, press, religion, freedom of assembly, freedom of petition. Second Amendment, we know, is the right to bear arms. And there's, the first 10 really focus on two things: personal freedoms, and oddly, and we'll look at this next week, the rights of somebody accused of a crime and in a trial. Like 5 of them or something are focused on a trial, which tells you something about their view back then in 1789, 1791. They must have been very concerned about unfair trials, because like half of the first 10 amendments are about that. And then you get them just one by one. I'm sorry, the first number here is the year it was ratified. You get them one by one. Shortly after the Civil War, you have what they call the Reconstruction Amendments. The 13th Amendment abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment made everyone a citizen regardless of race. And the 15th Amendment said you cannot, gave everybody the right to vote regardless of race. So ending of slavery, giving former enslaved people citizenship, and then giving them the right to vote. Then you have a good long while before you get another amendment where they come up with the income tax. And then we see the 18th Amendment, Prohibition. 19th Amendment, women get the right to vote. Some little things. The president takes office on January 20th instead of March 4th. I don't know why that was changed. It was interesting that became such a big deal at that time. Why were they so concerned about that? 1951, they pass a law. They pass an amendment that the president can only serve for 2 terms. Up until then, you have during the Great Depression, 30s and into 40s through World War II, you have Franklin Roosevelt, FDR, get elected 4 times to be president. And then he died during his 4th term. After that, they said, well, you know what? Maybe that's not a good idea. To have one person be president for that long, that's maybe not the best thing for America.
Oh, my question is, can I ask you a question, please?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
If some president was re-elected for second term and then he just did something else and we got another president, can the previous one be elected again in 4 or 8 years? Or no? Or just 2 times during his lifetime?
Right. My understanding is it's 2 terms, period. Yeah. They could be, it'd be interesting to have somebody serve one term.
I'm sorry, that's what happened in Russia with Putin. He was re-elected twice and they had the same law. And then another president was there, Medvedev. Actually, Medvedev was vice president during Putin presidency. And then after Medvedev's 4 years presidency, Putin was elected again, and he's still there.
Right. And my
Can this
understanding,
happen here?
yeah, and that was kind of the plan all along, right? That Medvedev wasn't Putin like the prime minister for that time
Yeah,
period? And then he
yeah.
comes back and he becomes president again. So I think that's Putin sort of cheating a little bit and getting around those rules so that he can become president for a very long time. Yeah, I believe in America. I believe it's
So that amendment, yeah.
right, 2 terms, period.
Just twice during lifetime.
Yeah, yeah. Now, interestingly, I forget who it was. It was, I think it was not one of the more famous presidents, Grover Cleveland. He served I think he served 2 terms. This is like in the 19 teens, maybe. He retired from being president, didn't want to run for re-election, and then was named as Supreme Court Justice. So he was a previous president, and then the next president, or another president after him, named him to the Supreme Court. I think that's kind of cool. Then you have another president who later went on to become a senator. So they stayed involved. You just can't be president for more than 2 terms now. So what do you think? Look at the years, and it's interesting also to see the years that these things passed, right? It took 1920 before women got the right to vote. So look at the years that these were ratified and look at what, the things that were passed. Do any of these strike you as surprising? Or what do we think is also the important amendments? What do you think are the big ones?
That's one of the big ones, the ones you have highlighted. Women get the right to vote.
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, that's a big one. I mean, it's hard.
Repealing of prohibition.
Yeah, the repeal of prohibition.
Abolish slavery.
Yeah. Hard to imagine society. I mean, that was a long time ago, but hard to imagine society with slavery today. Hard to imagine society now without women. How would we explain that if women did not have the right to vote,
Right.
So some of these are big, some are not so big. Washington, D.C. residents can vote for president. Washington, D.C. is a really interesting situation because it's not a state, but it's not in any of the states. It is meant to be, our nation's capital is its own thing. It's surrounded by Virginia and Maryland, but they're not in any states. I believe they have senators, but those senators cannot vote, I think. I could be wrong about that. But there was a constitutional amendment in 1961 that Washington, D.C. residents can vote for president. Up until that time, the people living in the nation's capital couldn't vote for president. If you look at these, and there's a story behind all of them. If you look at them, there's a historical explanation. 1804, separate ballots for president and vice president. when they first passed the Constitution, how do you think they elected the vice president?
That's a good question.
I mean, today now, you have a president and a vice president together. But that wasn't how it originally was.
The person that was running, was it the person that was running? Just, if he was elected, he was able to appoint a vice president?
No, they didn't appoint the vice president. Originally, they'd have the national vote, and the person who won became president. The person with the second highest number of electoral college votes became vice president, which is interesting because those two people may not work well together or see eye to eye on many things. So that's how it was through the, well, actually it doesn't take very long because it's when was George Washington? George Washington was 1892. So it was like basically the third presidential election, and they're like, hey, this isn't going to work. Like this is not a good system. So then they changed it. They said, okay, president, vice president, you can run together. You can be a couple. You can be a pair. So these are the constitutional amendments. Again, there's a historical story behind all of them. And especially if you look at the year, and I typed this up, and I definitely wanted to put the year on there because I think that's interesting and important to see, okay, anti-poll tax, which means, anybody know what that means? 1964, having an ending the poll tax.
Does that mean that everybody was, everybody who was a voter had to pay a tax to vote?
Yeah. So poll meaning like going to the polls to vote. Up until 1964, 1960s is the civil rights movement. There was a tax to vote. And I think it was established locally, and so it could be $1, it could be $10, it could be $100. I don't know. And that was meant to keep people from voting that didn't have a lot of money. Well, at that time, and historically, and certainly throughout the civil rights movement, if you're going to block poorer people or less money, people with less income, that's generally going to be in certain areas, that's going to be minorities. So having a poll tax was a way to keep minorities from voting. But you could say, oh, you're allowed to vote. Of course you're allowed to vote. You just have to pay a poll tax. Well, that's a way of keeping people from voting. Well, 1964, part of the civil rights movement was they passed a constitutional amendment making that illegal. You can't, if people have the right to vote, you can't make it overly difficult for them to do that. Okay, so there's a historical explanation and story behind all of these. It was 1992 since we passed the last constitutional amendment, which was Congress can give themselves pay raises, but it doesn't take effect immediately. It takes effect after the next election, right? A small change, but it must have been important at the time, something people were concerned about. So that's prohibition and the constitutional amendments. So we can wrap up here. Any questions about those things?
No, thank you. I just missed maybe about 5 minutes of our lesson, so I
Yeah, Nadia. Yeah, I saw that you had to log back in, so that's good that you got that worked out. I'll send this out to everybody. Carmen, actually, I'll tell you what. Let me give you. Okay, let me find here. Carmen, I'm going to put in the chat my email, and if you could send me. Well, I can't type and talk at the same time. Okay, there's my email in the chat. If you would write that down, send me an email, Carmen, and then I'll send this out to you because I have everybody else's email. So send me an email today sometime, and I'll send this information out. I'll share the recording of this class. I'll share this link. I'll share this document we looked over. And then you can look it over. I always say the best way to learn something is we do something like this, and then tomorrow, this weekend, even a week from now, look this over. Even just by breezing over it quickly, you're going to get it deeper into your brain. You're going to say, oh yeah, I remember that stuff in the First Amendment or the amendments and prohibition. And you're going to, when you look at something once in your life, you don't learn it very well. So look it over. I'll send this out. Look it over this weekend. Just, relearn it a little bit. And yeah, I think this was I think I like this topic. It was fun. Next week, yeah, well, let's focus on the Bill of Rights. We'll look at the first 10 amendments.
Thank you so much. I was really enjoying this class.
Good.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, thanks for talking, everybody. Have a good day, and I'll send out an email later.
You too. Enjoy your day. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good day, everybody.